Welcome back, everybody, to Democracy Tomorrow. I am here today with three fantastic guests, as always, Jordan and Nigel. And our special guest today is Michael Wayne, speaking to us from upstate New York. Just a reminder to everybody, we are hosting the Democracy Mind training program from the 8th of October until the 17th of December this year. An 11-week course where we're going to delve as deeply as we possibly can into the intersection between psychology and politics and how to really tease out the most positive elements of both politics and psychology to allow us to facilitate the building of foundations of a world where global democracy and world citizenship can be practicalized at a level that we have never seen before. We are really at a global political crossroads moment right now, not just in the United States, but globally, where the forces of authoritarianism, autocracy, dictatorship are really on the ascendancy in countries across the world, including Australia, which has largely been immune to this in recent years. But things have changed fundamentally in recent months, where the extreme right wing party that exists here has existed for 30 years, very much on the periphery of things, is now leading national polls in a country which has prided itself, rightfully so, on the strength of its democratic system. So we're speaking today in the context of not just that, but countless wars, ever worsening wars across the world today, ongoing poverty at levels that are averaging around 70% of the world population living essentially paycheck to paycheck, climate change worse than it's ever been. Recent data points to by far the hottest year in history, having been the most recent year. Nuclear weapons are still pointed in all sorts of directions, putting the entire planet at risk. The list goes on. How do we move from the world in which we now find ourselves towards a much more democratic, fair, and equitable world grounded in our shared humanity? And that's what we'll be talking about today with Michael Wayne. So with that, let me give the floor over to Jordan Bakker, who will introduce today's session, and we'll get right to it. Jordan, over to you.
Thank you so much, Scott. So in this global moment, we're really excited to be speaking to Michael Wayne. Sometimes we use this analogy of puzzle pieces, and in a way, it's like all 8 billion of us hold a different puzzle piece. And if we put them together, maybe we can create this much more beautiful sort of planetary society. And I think Michael is holding a unique puzzle piece because of his unique life experiences. So who is Dr. Michael Wayne? Well, he's an author, he's a documentary maker, he's also an acupuncturist and a change agent. His desire to help people find their own leading edge, and by doing so, to be part of the greatest paradigm shift we have ever seen. So as you can hear, he's quite a visionary. He's a practitioner of acupuncture, Chinese medicine, and integrative medicine. He's got over 25 years of experience in the field. His PhD is in quantum integral medicine, a field that he pioneered, about the science of emerging properties and how it relates to the innate healing system and human potential. He's the author of, I think you said it's 5 books now, Michael, and it includes the groundbreaking quantum integral medicine and most recently, the quantum revolution, the power to transform. I believe there might be an even more recent one. Could you remind us what that is?
Yeah, in 2022, a book that I wrote came out called Toward a More Perfect Union from Scarcity to Abundance for All.
Great. Thank you, Michael. He's the founder and director of the Center for Quantum Revolution. His work has been praised by Marianne Williamson, by Dr. Larry Dossey. It's been featured in the New York Post, Alternative Medicine, and Martha Stewart's Whole Living. Michael's vision is of a new society that's holistic, sustainable, and enlightened. And we are so excited to have him on the show today to really explore what's this connection between our internal lives, between our consciousness, and between the state of our politics. So big welcome to you, Michael.
Thank you, Jordan, and thank you, Nigel and Scott. Very much appreciate this.
So, wanting to just begin by kind of foregrounding your professional work. So, would love it if you could kind of give us really elaborate on what your professional work has involved. What's the current state of that professional work? Love to hear about some of the books, the documentaries, and kind of what your goal is with this body of work that you're building.
So I think the common thread through all of this is I've been intertwined with the medicine work and the political activism work, but I think all of it is really about the singular thread is serving humanity in different ways, but they're all interrelated. Working with people in the health field, trying to help people become healthier, and also helping them to understand I can speak for the United States, not so much for Australia, the the problems with the medical system, which is not only quantitative but also qualitative in that, and this was my first book, Quantum Integral Medicine, in the paradigm that's used in Western medicine. So that goes for Australia, United States, Europe, or anywhere in the world where Western medicine is the predominant field of medicine. The paradigm has many great things about it, but a lot of flaws that just are problematic. So that's one thread, and over the years of practice, just just feeling the calling to do more than help people one on one. Nothing wrong with that, but also to serve humanity in a bigger way, which led to me writing books and evolving the scope of my books, and also making films. And my last film being a documentary feature film called How to Save Democracy that just came out this year in February.
Michael, I'd love to slow down first. This first part of your career and your professional identity sounds like it's around quantum integral medicine and more holistic approach to medicine. So I really love that nuanced way that you've appreciated the positive things about the Western medical model, but also suggested there's ways for it to evolve further. So could you kind of share like some of the key principles or key features that distinguish the approach that you resonate with more as opposed to the more Western model?
Let me go back to when I was a kid and schooling. And in those days, I was a very big math geek. And and you learn algebra and geometry and trigonometry. And in geometry, there's a field that the field that people are taught is what is called Euclidean geometry. But then I learned that not in my schooling days as a kid, but there's another field of geometry called non-Euclidean geometry, which is also known as nonlinear dynamics. And this is where Western medicine doesn't understand that. It's the understanding that, I mean, in quantum sciences and chaos sciences and complexity science, that there's self-organizing systems, that things like the butterfly effect, just things that can happen, dynamics that aren't always predictable in a very linear 1 + 1 = 2 way. So we could say like the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And this is what acupuncture is about the creation, the emergence of what, and psychology too, is the emergence of what can come and what is new, and that we are changing and we can evolve. So, so with my patients, my acupuncture practice, I meet them where they are. Some people just come to be fixed, and other people come because they're interested in something more, growth, evolution. So, that's where my work was, still is. But, I wanted to also practice what I preach in evolution of myself, so, in a way, so to speak, and let my work also evolve.
So I'm hearing it's like maybe the more Western medicalized model is you find the particular cause of the symptoms and then you treat that discrete cause and then somebody gets better. But what that approach may not be sensitive to is that we are these hyper complex systems. So we have all these different aspects that are all interconnected and all influence one another. And so that model of just trying to, isolate the singular problem and just address that may not affect the totality of the system. Is that kind of in the right direction, Michael?
You put it really well, Jordan. It's reductionism is what Western medicine is all about, finding the one, breaking something down to the single component that might cause it. And sometimes in situations that are black and white, there is one specific thing, but mostly in chronic illness, that's not the case. And let's say like with pharmaceutical applications, pharmaceutical medicine, part of Western medicine, there's usually the side effects, the unpredictability of what could happen. And I've heard from many a time from patients that they have side effects. They call their doctor's office and the doctor or a nurse says, well, that is not a side effect of the medication, so therefore it cannot be the side effect. And I say, no, that's wrong. And side effects are only, they're added to the potential side effects when enough people report them. So, yeah, it's always that reductionistic mindset. And we see that mindset not just in medicine, but throughout society, throughout civilization, always looking for the one cause, the one cure, whether it's war, we see this warring going on, which never seems to never end, as if that's the answer, as opposed to nuance and gray area. And that's one of the things Western medicine is worse at, as I said, chronic illness, and especially like autoimmune issues, because oftentimes there's viral components and viruses are just very intelligent and don't necessarily don't do well. It's very hard to squash them with medications, even though they're antiviral medications, which are really intense on the body. But viral medications or viral issues really kind of gets to like the Chinese understanding of the Tao, of the harmony of the opposites. How do we make peace in our own body? And that was the problem when COVID came, in that Western medicine, it was like the ultimate virus, a novel virus. Western medicine had no clue what to do. And not saying, I was all for people getting vaccines for it, but it freaked out the world and especially the Western societies, the modern societies, because this was like the roosters, the chickens coming home to roost, as like the coming back to bite us.
Yeah, it's so interesting, like the holistic approach as opposed to like this more reductionistic approach that you were describing. And yeah, I think with COVID, we really saw that in terms of like, these are hyper complex decisions that politicians needed to make about lockdowns, vaccinations, and so forth that had, like, for example, one of the impacts of the lockdowns was the social isolation and the psychological impacts of that, which how do you take into account all of these different variables and then make the right decision? It's really, really tricky. I'm curious. So I've got bit of a lower back niggle at the moment. So I wonder if you could share, like, if I was to see a more holistic practitioner who takes your approach, what would that look like for me, as opposed to, I don't know, going along to the doctor and then seeing the physio and getting some particular exercise? Is it much different to that, just to help really ground what this looks like?
Well, yeah, and I've had many a person come to see me in your situation, Jordan, and some people have had X-rays, MRI, imaging, and usually there's two causes. One is soft tissue, and the other is the bone, spine. So as long as it's not something that's really degenerative, where someone needs something more serious like surgery, acupuncture can be very helpful. I'll also talk to a person, see what they're doing in life that that their pain is. If there's something chronic, for a lot of people, it's just situational, something they did, whether working out or exercise or, just lifting, moving. Um, so it's just, so I might give them exercises too. Um, and then a lot of times might even talk to them about their diet, because a lot of people, if their diet is not so great, it causes inflammation in the body. Uh, so yeah, look at the person in the big picture standpoint.
I'd like to just shift back to some of your comments a little earlier, Michael, because they really kind of caught me quite a bit. That this is something that reflects a lot of my interest. That the linear reductionism of a Newtonian Cartesian paradigm that looks at subject object differentiation and then reduces things to something out there, has led to incredible developments in specialization. We've learned lots of details, but medicine, I think, as you're pointing to, Western medicine is a little bit caught in its over specialization now, and it's over functioning at the level of specificity. Psychology has now, certainly in Australia and from what I understand in America, psychology has followed a medical model of reductionism and identification of singularity of problem. And so there's a kind of a reductive kind of quality to the way that we're even viewing the mind as a set of discrete problems. When we talk about a quantum view, and we talk about a view of the physical universe that was basically explored in the 1920s and developed a different way of looking at the world, it doesn't seem to have really entered into the popular culture. So I'm interested in your view of the nature of interconnection as a way of approaching a very, very different orientation to this singularity and reductionism that seems to be part of the problem in dissipation at the moment. We're so much a set of singular parts, nothing's holding together in any kind of meaningful way other than authoritarianism.
That last sentence is on the mark, Nigel. Um, yeah, it's, the Western medicine, like the Western way of thinking, is very dualistic. So the body and mind are, there's some movement now to understand that the body and mind are connected. People on holistic field or yoga talk about mind body work, but but that split, the mind, for your body, you go to a MD, and for your mind, you go to a psychologist, therapist, and and psychiatrists just give out medication. So they're not even really talking to people. But there's, as the field of psychoneuroimmunology pointed out, the mind is all throughout the body. And in Chinese medicine, it said that the mind resides in the heart. Um, so so, so it's well known that in certain quarters, that physical ailments can be caused for psychological reasons. It used to be that, maybe still to some degree, if you went to a physician, a doctor, and they can't figure out what's going on, nothing looks on paper, everything looks good, they may just say, "Oh, it's all in your head." I mean, I don't hear people telling me that they get like condescending and brushed off like that, but it used to be, and even a little bit now, it's all in your head and you're all good. So yeah, it's a very unfortunate thing that that split, that dualism still perpetuates, and to this day.
Why is it so culturally difficult for us, do you think? Why is it that, like, you work from an interconnected way of being, from what I understand, and there are so many traditions that do the same, but the Western mind seems to be very resistant to that as interconnection. And I'm just interested in, how you work with a quantum view, with a kind of an interconnected view, and why is it that it's so hard for Westerners to grasp?
That's the big question, that disconnection from the earth, from our bodies, that dissociation in a way. Not, just even in terms of diet, not for a lot of people, they never think about what they put in their mouth and how that affects your health. And then take it one step further, where they get their food from. Here in the US, probably in Australia, big supermarkets that you walk in and just buy whatever food you're buying, packaged up a lot of times. It's ingrained in traditional cultures to be connected to the earth, and in modern cultures, disconnected to some degree. And even before the word democracy was around, indigenous traditional cultures had a form of democracy. And in the US, the home of the modern democracy, or the oldest constitutional democracy in the world, um, democracy in the US was borrowed from the indigenous peoples of the Northeast to create the democracy that we have. But unfortunately, in America, that those ideas weren't perpetuated very long. And one of the ideas was, the famous phrase of the seventh generation. That was one of the things that was understood in Native cultures. The founding fathers of the U.S., who wrote the U.S. Constitution, used their ideas to put their Constitution together.
That seventh generation principle is so powerful. Could you just elaborate on what that means, that seventh generation?
Yeah, it's such a big thing. It's like our, understanding how our actions, um, the ramifications of our actions going down generations. So the idea of climate change, if we thought about, if we had that idea, seventh generations in our mind, we would think about what we are doing to the earth and how does that impact future generations. We're not great stewards right now, or war, or democracy, or health, just all these things that we don't take into account, not any sort of long-sightedness. It's all short-sightedness. Like the stock market, it's always about, the quarterly returns and investments versus what will a company do to create a better tomorrow. AI is a big thing, right? Is like, in everybody's mind, and it's all about, but the technology companies are doing their best to not have guardrails on it. They want to just do what they want, as opposed to the guardrails, so we can say, slow down. Let's do the best we can for everybody, and for future generations. So those ramifications, cut across the board. That idea of seven generations.
It's fascinating, isn't it, that we work in political cycles of, in Australia, it's 3 years that we have elections. In America, it's 4 years. You compare that to seven generations in the future, and I think they also looked at 7 generations in the past as well, didn't they?
Oh,
To
yeah.
kind of
Uh-huh.
understand, the implications of all our actions in the present. Um, the short-sightedness of the way we're organising our processes, but of course, it also is a kind of a measure, isn't it, to stop untrammeled power. So we shorten and control, but we create these cycles. Might be something, Scott, you've got some thoughts on as well as Michael, in terms of these cycles.
Well, how's this for a cynical reply? I'm all for the seven generation system. However, I fear that a number of our dictatorial friends have also latched onto this idea and hope to apply it to themselves, as you see despotic regimes lasting in multi-generational contexts. So let's hope that only is isolated to a handful of countries, but it is it is one of the quests for the authoritarians out there, and it's not just the current leader of any country. It's the family dynasties that they seek to build, which is the ultimate in, antithetical ways of running a government to solid grassroots direct democracy. It's the polar opposite. And that is emerging all over the place. And this spirit, this term has been mentioned a few times, serving humanity, something that all four of us and hopefully millions and millions of others do in our own ways every single day. Recalling, of course, that it brought back to me the best episode ever of one of the greatest television shows ever, The Twilight Zone from the 1950s. The title of the show was To Serve Man.
Mm.
And as it turns out, it's a long story, but aliens come to Earth. They have a book. They give it to some, linguistic experts. They're translating the book throughout the episode, and all these humans decide to go with the aliens on their spaceship up into space because it's supposed to be so much better there. And then, as the last person is getting on the ship and the door is closing, the translators come back. They go, "Don't close the door. Don't get on. It's a cookbook." Right. So To Serve Man turned out to be a cookbook. So again, and the cynical approach. But how do we get back? You mentioned AI too, of course, very easily described as the most profound technological development in the history of our species in terms of the implications that it can have in every single level of society. And we're only at the well under 1% of its capacity right now. How do we get back to that basic serving humanity perspective, and ensure that we don't serve the algorithm and the machine and the AI and the Claude and the Chat GPT and everything else at the expense of, the unique little experiment that we are as 8.2 billion people across the planet. What's the missing link right now? How can we, breathe new life into the sails, into the wind of a spirit of, global orientation in worldview, where people are no longer looking inward as so many people are these days, but rather simultaneously inward and outward, and have as much care and compassion for people in Botswana or Brazil or Belgium or wherever it may be as they do for their immediate family and neighbors and certainly country. We need to move back into that, the direction that the basic foundations of international law speak of, the inherent dignity of the human person and the rights of everyone everywhere. And we've seemed to have lost that spirit in recent years, and we need to regain it and make it much stronger, in fact. And so how do we do that? How do we get there, Michael? Simple question.
Yeah. I think, um, let's say democracy is the most evolved form of government, or the alternatives are, and I'm not talking about the economic system, capitalism, socialism, communism, just the political system, democracy versus dictatorship, monarchy. Those were when the people of Europe came to the United States, that's what they were escaping, and they wanted to create something new. But I think we need to take democracy to the next level, or maybe to the level it once had, a more direct democracy where people have more of a say. And through things like citizens' assembly and direct democracy, deliberative democracy, there's a lot of ideas out there, because we're seeing, this problem with AI and wars and everything. It's a few people you're talking about the dictatorship and authoritarianism, Scott. A few people have hijack power for themselves, for their own interests, which usually there's a lot of kleptocratic actions going on, and they're hijacking society and the world at the same process. So there needs to be more democracy. There is a woman by the name of Jane Addams, who was the first American woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize, I think in the 1930s. She said the cure for the ills of democracy is more democracy. So I think, and that's why, like Silicon Valley or some of these tech billionaires do not like democracy, or are doing what they can to corrupt democracy and pervert it, because they know if people have their will, if the will of the people happens, some of their capabilities and power and money may be taken away.
Just wanting to, I guess, slow down and kind of recap where we've come from, just so that we're like kind of all on the same page and to check that I'm listening right. So I guess we've started this conversation exploring this sort of quantum paradigm, interconnected paradigm, compared it to the more linear, black and white, potentially reductionistic paradigm, and how that applies to medicine and health, and your work in acupuncture, Michael. Nigel, you also mentioned that that's been something we've been grappling with in psychology, the medical model, and over 100 years into the science of psychology, and we're having real problems. Like, yes, the DSM is in some ways the best model that we've got, but it's got these really big limitations, this diagnostic model. So I guess we've been tracking that this paradigm is not maybe the best paradigm to take us where we could be in terms of health. And then we kind of were looking at what are the challenges in this in the Western context for us to move beyond this reductionistic sort of mindset. What is it about this modern thinking that is sort of getting in the way of us appreciating this more holistic perspective that maybe in more traditional societies might have come a little bit more naturally? And then we're sort of looking at this idea of 7 generations in the future with the Native American system that helped inform America's democracy in that more holistic way. And then we sort of went a little bit down and we were exploring, I guess the current moment, like, why is democracy not fulfilling its promise now? And what are the forces of erosion? And, Scott, you were sharing about how some of these really beautiful notions like serving humanity or even 7 years of the future can get corrupted and get kind of reduced into something like an authoritarian leader can kind of use those same kinds of slogans, but kind of pervert the meaning. And we've also been kind of thinking about what might a more direct, more evolved democracy, more direct democracy look like now. So that's just, I guess, kind of foregrounding, the conversation. And want to just check, Michael, in a moment, I want to ask a little bit more about your work in this democracy space, just so that the audience really appreciates the kind of work you've done there. But just wanting to check, Michael, am I kind of tracking the threads properly?
Yeah, no, we've already gone pretty wide ranging, but I think the unifying theme is that dualistic mind, reductionist mind, that Western mind that doesn't see the synthesis of so many things and how everything's interconnected. And I think if humans were able to have that bigger mind or quantum mind, integral mind, whatever term you want to use, they would think about 7 generations and they would think about how do we can create a more peaceful world and a better and more humane and fair and compassionate society and just. And so, a lot of it comes from the mind, and that's dualistic split, which creates policies that are flawed, that do not serve humanity, not even the cookbook style. And so everything just gets corrupted, which is where we stand now.
So, Michael, I'm really curious to hear a little bit more about your work at the intersection of the consciousness and then bring that back into politics. So you've had this background in acupuncture, in quantum integral medicine. How has that transitioned into political work? Could you help us understand that transition and just, I guess, explain, you've written this book, you've done these couple of documentaries. Love you to, feel free to, take quite some time to really help us understand what that body of work is and what was the impulse behind it.
Yeah, well, I think I've always been one to advocate for the evolution of consciousness and the evolution of us as human beings. But I started seeing that just, even though like Gandhi famously said, be the change you want to see in the world, which is a very important statement, it wasn't enough we weren't going to make this a better world individually. There needed action. Even the Dalai Lama has talked about meditation is enough. We need action. And so during COVID, I wrote that book, Toward a More Perfect Union, From Scarcity to Abundance for All. And the first half looked at the problems the facing, it was very U.S. centric, the book, but really can be extrapolated to many other countries, most of the modern world. And I looked at the problem, and then I looked at the solutions. And the solutions, what I found in my research was that modern democracy is based on human flourishing. The ideas that going back, the term eudaimonia, going back to the ancient Greek philosophers, especially Aristotle and Epicurus. And this led to the Enlightenment thinkers, John Locke and others, who talked about those similar ideas. And it led to when the United States was becoming a democratic nation in the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, who was influenced by Locke and the Greek philosophers, also talked about, Jefferson famously wrote Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. And they were believers in human flourishing, even though they were also slave owners, these American pioneers of democracy. So and when I started understanding it, I saw the intersection of the personal growth, societal growth, and it's all about human flourishing. And so it comes down to why can't we have a society where everyone has the capability to flourish, to prosper? And then I looked through history, in the United States history, not too long ago, there was a period of time from the 1930s through the 1970s in the United States where that ideal was met in not imperfect. Black people did not have it as good as white people, but there was strides made, and a lot of that was the wealth inequality was tamped down, taxation rates were high. The New Deal philosophy of Franklin Roosevelt, that government serves the people. And it led to, there's a famous book written in 1936, I believe, by the famous poet Carl Sandburg that was called The People, Yes. And what he was getting at, and was that when a government helps people to flourish, to meet their basic needs, people flourish and they're happier. And that's why the title of the book was The People, and that was his poem, The People, Yes, that people feel good about society. And contrast it with now, where like in the United States, I think it's like 15% of people trust government. And so when you don't have trust in government, democracy falters. And that's what we're seeing in the United States. People are cynical, and then they go towards someone who claims they're going to fix it, like Donald Trump, and they go, and he's going to kick the cart over. He's going to break up the elites. He used all this language that sounded good, and people like, yeah, he's for me. And so these are themes that I had in my book, and then my recent film, How to Save Democracy, I delved into it more. So, and as I said in that book, Toward a More Perfect Union, I talked about politics and economics and psychology and spirituality, because they're kind of all interchangeable to create a society that works for all. And it's not pie in the sky to create that. It can be done. It has been done. And we see better examples of democracy in the social democracies of the world. Europe, Western Europe, Nordic countries, Australia, even though, Scott was talking about the problems, the far right, the rise of the far right in Australia, and not knowing exactly what's going on in Australia, I would say similar problems with the wealth inequality, government serving certain people, and then whatever levels of migration there are. And then you got these demagogues who come and talk about, this is all screwed up, we'll fix it. And they play to, certain xenophobic tendencies some people have, and, it becomes a mess.
Thanks for sharing, Michael. And that sounds like you said, truly ambitious project of the intersection between the political, economic, psychological, spiritual. That's, I guess, very similar to what we're trying to explore in our upcoming course in Democracy Mind, which is kicking off in October. Scott, I'm interested to throw to you because, I've known you for 16 years or so. And that's been I guess I see parallels between Michael's story and your story. Like, Scott, you told me that this sense of your experience of oneness, like, having some states of oneness and experiencing like the oneness of the planet was really the driving force in you getting politicized and, identifying as a world citizen and, wanting to help, like feeling like if we can change the political systems, that might help collective flourishing at like this incredible level. And I think, although you're just a person, I think you've done a pretty amazing job in terms of helping change systems in a way. So I'm just curious, Scott, like, if there's any threads that you'd like to explore with Michael around that as we shift the dialogue more into the political space.
You mentioned earlier today the general generic position of the Silicon Valley crowd vis-a-vis maintenance and increase of their own power to the detriment of democratic decision making ultimately, not just in the United States, but globally. And it's really important to point out an obvious fact, but often people don't make the link. But there's a very clear relationship between those within, and it is literally, I just wrote a novel about this, so I know the exact percentage, 0.00003% of humanity who are billionaires, 3,428 right now, and their disdain ultimately for democracy. They don't want democracy in the end because they know that democracy is going to certainly result in a reduction in their economic and currently political power. So and if you want to hear a statement uttered more frequently by more billionaires than anything else, it is some formulation of globalization is bad, world government is the Antichrist, and we must never have a unified political system in which democracy is the basis of decision making. And so therefore we have a real problem on our hands. And, if that group of people is in charge of AI, essentially, which they are, totally supporting with financial and other means governments around the world, including in Australia, and at least politicians, if not governments, how do we build structures which address the extreme inequality that we're now experiencing, unlike anything the world has ever seen, even in the feudal times, where even the poorest billionaire, for goodness sakes, is hundreds of thousands of times wealthier than the median person in the world who has a net worth of around $7,000 and somehow this has been allowed to happen. And somehow it's viewed by many people still as a positive thing, despite the fact that it clearly undermines democracy. And take there's so many examples I could give, but there's a move underway in California to create a new political entity that will be run from a agglomeration of barges attached to one another in international waters, which will no longer be bound by any national law. This is their objective. So basically just this free port, free for all, total libertarian situation. You can only imagine the labor rights situation on that barge. And that's just one of countless, examples. So, democracy is very much not a given. Democracy is a rarity in the world today. Far fewer countries, far fewer lower percentage of the human race lives in a strong democracy than lives in a non-strong democracy or autocracy. And the numbers are going in the wrong direction. So let's get as practical as we can, Michael. What can be done, not just to, save democracy generically, but specific things you think are fundamental to strengthening democracy where it exists and bringing democracy into existence where it doesn't exist?
I would say, like I brought up the United States, 1930s through 1970s, one of the things that was happening was the income tax, the highest marginal rates. They averaged, I don't know, in the upper 70s. In the 1950s, they were 90%. So it was almost like a salary cap in a way. If you made a certain amount of money, most of your income was going to the government. And because of that New Deal philosophy that went through all those years, there was in the United States, there was the story was, let's do what's right for the common good. So in the 1950s, it was a Republican president, Dwight Eisenhower, that oversaw 90% taxation rates. So there's talk now, people like Thomas Piketty and other economists who've talked about wealth tax, global tax, some sort of taxation system, because these billionaires, you're right, Scott, they want to create their own realms, these network states and freedom cities in California, Honduras, Hong Kong, and various London, all over the world. I'm sure Australia has places like, or Peter Thiel he has citizenship in New Zealand. So, so that's one thing that wealth tax, and also allowing corporations to set up shop wherever they want, around the world, shop for the best corporate rates, and the money laundering and the tax havens that they park their money. It's one of the biggest scandals of all time. So much of their money is hidden. And it's really unfortunate that occurs. Another idea Piketty has that I think is worth giving serious thought to, his idea of minimum universal inheritance. And I don't think he's just talking about he's French, so he's not talking about just the United States, but he's talked about, and some other economists have brought it up too, that everybody, when they're born, is given a minimum inheritance. He's put the number at 150,000. Well, he's talked about dollars. So, I perhaps that's from the translation from French to English. So I don't know, euros or Australian dollars or different currency. And that's because, we're seeing that so many of the wealthy now don't earn it. It's just through inheritance. Capital gains tax are so low. So some of these economic solutions really are the way. And that's why in my book, I didn't talk politics, but also economics, because we can create that abundance for all, that allows everyone to prosper. Universal basic income is another idea that's been floated around, and the money is there. It's the mindset, going back to psychology. It's that mindset. Oh, we can't help people. It's this weird mentality. Oh, if we help people, they become helpless. Meanwhile, we give corporate welfare to, and government handouts to the richest people, whatever they need. So there are very specific solutions, Scott. That's what I'm getting at.
I love those.
Right.
I love what you're sharing, Michael, about those very specific solutions that kind of like, as you share them, this thing comes like, like why isn't that the way it is, or are you something like that? Like they almost seem commonsensical, and then it's bizarre that that's not the way the system is. And then I love how you brought it back to the psychological barriers, Michael, like that are interfering with us appreciating that. Nigel, I wonder if you could speak to that, if you have further questions around, like, what are the psychological barriers that might be getting in the way of us appreciating the value of those kinds of practical measures?
I think one of the points that I heard Michael make earlier was this kind of concept of trust in government, trust in community. And, what's really interesting is in this kind of devolution of democracy, what we have is rising distrust in the value of government, distrust in the reliability of government. The neurobiological kind of function of that is to focus our brain on survival activity, adrenocortical processes. We start feeling threatened. We start feeling more focused on our survival than we are on anything collaborative. Collaboration, which is what the context of democracy is, one in which we recognize interconnected higher order organization. And that's a principle of democracy. that can't thrive in the context of fear. That can't thrive in the context of reactivity. And people in power will often recognize that. And there are ways in which people in power disseminate conflict. They create doubt. They bring things into question in order to create fear. When we create fear, we then create anger. So we get some dissipation of the fear. We create an other that we can hate. And then all of a sudden we've got a controlling factor. Daddy comes home to look after us all. And so this idea of kind of nation state, this idea of, what's gone on in America over the last 50 years of this kind of devolution back into medieval thinking, where, the emanation of the word of God is what people need to follow as an absolute. It's a cure for the fear and disconnection that people are feeling. And what happens in democracy is institutions are established, trade unions are established, education systems are established, health systems are established, roads and bridges are built. So we create this kind of sense of interconnected community, which leads and facilitates a sense of collaboration, which is the psychological superordinate organizing principle of the species. We group together as a species. That's our drive. That's what's gotten us here. But we misuse that. And it becomes, kind of group escape from our fear and our helplessness and our hopelessness, because that's what power systems know how to disorganize. That's, kind of your classic function of autocratic propaganda. Amplify and perpetuate fear. And as a kind of a worker in the body and in medicine, Michael, that kind of, I wonder what your thoughts are on just the way that our systems, our individual systems respond to these kind of grouping systems. Autocracy, fear; democracy, collaboration, perhaps, but maybe I'm oversimplifying it.
Those are good points, Nigel. The reptilian brain, the brainstem, the reptilian brain has those survival instincts, and fear is definitely one of them. Everything are attacking, everything about survival, and it takes higher brain processes, the neocortex and the higher brain functions, cognitive functions, to see collaboration as the model to live towards. I mean, it was Darwin. Darwin put forth I think it called the sympathy hypothesis, that the evolution of the species happens when there's collaboration, when people look out for one another. His ideas were perverted into survival of fittest, which he never put forth. So yeah, so politicians, especially authoritarians and reactionaries, instinctively play up those survival, play up the fear, especially of the other, and that's powering a lot of these far right movements around the world. Is these others are coming to take away your jobs, or to take away everything you know and cherish and love, and they're going to change society for the worse. So that's what they put forth. And it's just, it's playing to the worst human instincts, as opposed to, the higher aspirations of humanity and people. So, I think we are seeing a movement in the United States, and hopefully Australia and other countries too, of political leaders who are speaking to that higher ideal and higher aspiration, and people are hungry for that. And that's a positive sign going on.
Just to follow on from that, Michael, all hope is not lost, not
Mhm.
even close. And it may feel that way to a lot of people. You may open the newspaper or your whatever newspaper you read online and get completely distressed and bummed out by all the stories. And it's very easy to fall prey to that. But it's also important to stand back and look at the big picture as well, and not forget that the whatever processes of evolution there are that guide life on this planet continue on, notwithstanding the wars and the conflict and the hatred and the despair and the discrimination that is apparent in so many places where politics has essentially gone through or going through a sort of toxic period. And it's interesting to look at, the post Cold War era and the immediate aftermath, which is where I kind of, came of age in my working life. The sky was the limit. Suddenly, these forces of goodness were released that were kept under wraps, really, from 1945 until 1989. And then you could do anything, and anything was imaginable. And the humanitarian budgets of the world quadrupled or more. The UN had influence and impact like never before. International law was better and bigger than ever before. The International Criminal Court was established in 1998, something that was totally impossible before the end of the Cold War, and countless other really positive developments happened. And now we have the very much opposite happening in some quarters, primarily led, unfortunately, by the United States and their closest ally, Israel, who is both simultaneously doing everything they can to undermine the international legal order because they know were they to comply with it, they couldn't do all the things that they're doing right now. And so, but it's really important to remember that the overwhelming majority of other countries in the world fully support the international rule of law and the International Criminal Court and basic human rights treaties and so on and so forth. So, don't lose hope. And also look at countries like, Hungary recently, the Netherlands recently, whole number of others that had gone through these kind of toxic, horrible, extreme right wing governments who basically swung back in the other direction. So probably the same will happen to Argentina when the next election comes around. Milei will be voted out of power. Maybe the highly imperfect, but nonetheless not as harsh. Peronis will probably be voted back into power, and then it will probably swing back. So the pendulum is always swinging. Um, our quest, of course, would be that it would swing at probably slightly less dramatic
Mm.
trajectory, either left or right. And, as we said in the last podcast episode, the price you pay for democracy is that you're not always going to win. And authoritarians always want to win, and they cannot handle losing. And that's why they develop systems to ensure that they maintain power and that they take democratic rights away from as many people as they can who might potentially vote them out of power. And you see countless examples of this in the United States right now, obviously, even down to the level of having to register to vote. That is an active act that 18-year-olds are not that interested in doing, and it starts from there. And then you get into redistricting, you get into voting, the extreme gerrymandering that's going on, specific voting day regulations, which are clearly targeted towards certain ethnic groups, and the list goes on and on and on. And as a result, United States has one of the lowest voting turnouts of any country in the world. So the conservative, extreme right wing elements and the extreme wealthy elements in that country are succeeding in undermining democracy. And the more you see it, as you said, the more you see it as a system that's not particularly performing well, the less likely you're going to invest your energy and time and interest in it. So either you don't participate or you don't take it all that seriously and you go, I'll let you take care of it, Mr. Authoritarian. You deal with it. I don't want to deal with it. And so, all of these things are structural and real. And I just wanted to add one other thing to the list that you um, came out with a few minutes ago about, concrete things to tackle, particularly the concentration of wealth issue. And one is simply a rapidly emerging issue of simply setting a global wealth limit on every individual on the planet. And
Mm.
Piketty deals with this in Capital and other sources. A lot of the international experts on tax policy are talking about this. There's a Dutch professor who talks about limitarianism. And I think we need to really urge people everywhere who's listening here and everywhere else to start having a discussion about this. Should we set limits on what every individual person on planet Earth can hold as wealth? Because unless we do that and we just have this free for all in which we're living through now, the results are very predictable. So, the European professor, I can't remember her name. Her first name's Ingrid. I think it's Ingrid Robbins from Utrecht University.
Mm.
Um, Her proposal, I think, is 10 million euros. So roughly, 12 million US dollars or something like that. And above that, you're taxed at 100%. So if we had a system like that, combined with no more tax havens, no more non-beneficial ownership of companies, which is very common in this world, and a minimum tax for all global transnational corporations and certainly pre-existing billionaires, then we start getting somewhere in the direction of, building a system of democracy that is not so easy to dismantle by those with resources.
Yeah, well put, Scott. And one of the things in the United States that's also perverting democracy is what has been called the tyranny of the minority, and this small faction of people who have corrupted and perverted the whole democratic process to lead the country, made up of billionaires and religious fundamentalists and ideologues and demagogues. And the United States Constitution needs a lot of reworking because it allows that. Um, and so in the United States, you have a right wing saying that the United States is not a democracy, but it's a republic, and which is a very strange, confusing. They're confused because the United States is a democratic republic, which means an indirect democracy. But they say that because what they're thinking is that in a democracy, then the majority becomes a mob and pushes their ideas on the minority, and and so they feel that's not what we want. We want our beliefs. We are the righteous few who our beliefs are correct. We've been channeled by God. We channel God or whoever to put our ideas on everybody. So, and yet the most extreme example of that in the United States is the Supreme Court, the 9 justices, lifetime appointed. Currently, 6 of them are very conservative, and their ideas are dictated onto a country of over 330 million people. And there's been some really horrible rulings. And, that's part of that. And that's the political part of the democratic failings, along with the economic part.
Michael, this has just been such a fascinating conversation. And I think Scott began this whole discussion with, talking about this global moment that I think a lot of people turn on global news and the response is one of despair or hopelessness or confusion and like, what on earth can we do? And I feel like in this discussion, we haven't shied away from talking about these difficult adversity trends that are facing us. But at the same time, there's been this, I guess, this thread of hope that I think has wound through this conversation. We've sort of contrasted the corruption with the possibility of collaboration. We've contrasted disconnection and this fragmentation and reductionism with interconnectedness and this sense of this perspective. And then to kind of quote Scott Leckey, contrasted the noneness with the oneness, it's sort of, and I guess that's what I'm noticing the more that I'm sitting in these dialogues and conversations is this sense that, yes, our global moment is hyper complex and there's some really concerning aspects, but there is a pattern here. There's like meaning beneath the madness. And the more that we kind of explore in these dialogues, the more I'm sensing the sort of like simplicity of some of these patterns. Like, oh yeah, human beings, when they get given unlimited resources, often it brings out the not too good aspects of our nature as one example. And so how do we create systems that address these aspects of our nature? So yeah, just thank you so much for this chat, Michael. It's been really illuminating and really inspiring to hear your body of work. I'd love to ask you some rapid fire questions, which we do with all of our guests here at the end in this Democracy Mind podcast. So first question for you. In one word, how would you describe the state of democracy around the world right now?
Troubled.
What's the biggest obstacle to people seeing themselves as world citizens rather than national citizens?
I think their level of consciousness and thinking and not being able to see as broad as possible, a world-centric view.
What's one thing you do personally to stay emotionally regulated when you encounter deep political disagreement?
A lot of times for some of the people who are on that other end of political disagreement, they say things to try and bait you, but that's the worst thing to do, to be baited. And instead what I do is I just ask them to say more. Just what do you
Mm,
mean by that?
mm.
I'm very interested in dialoguing. I'm happy to dialogue. So I just want to hear if they can say what they're thinking, and maybe we can find common ground.
Psychology or policy? If you had to put more faith in one to fix the world's problems, which would it be?
Well, that one I don't like the binary choice, but I talked about. So I think both, but I talked about the 1930s and the policies, the New Deal policies, and how it really helped people prosper, become happy. So I actually am a little more on the side of policy. I think it can change. Either way, we have to change the story of humanity, and I think policy can change the story, and personal psychology can change the story. But I think policy, I'm a little more on that side.
Who's your unexpected hero of world citizenship? Someone people might not immediately think of.
Actually, I would say Bruce Springsteen.
What gives you genuine hope right now, even amidst so much division and instability?
Well, I think that dark side of humanity and human behavior is so evident right now. The corruption, the kleptocracy, the fundamentalism, and so many people in the United States and around the world it's so clear, so overt that people are rising up. So I think the need is to navigate that and help people understand where it's not just what are you against, but what are you for? What's the vision of a new society, democratic tomorrow, democratic mind, and so I think that does lend hope amidst all the craziness.
Okay, finish this sentence, Michael. Democracy will thrive when we learn to.
Hear each other, and then also, just as we were talking earlier, when we put guardrails on wealth accumulation.
Beautiful, Michael. Well, what we do just to end is we just love to hear, I guess, each person just do a kind of, 1 to 2 minute checkout of just their impression of this conversation, I guess, what they're walking away with, what's still alive in their system. So we can just do a popcorn style. Whoever wants to go first, feel free to share. We'd love to hear your checkouts.
Well, one of the things that Michael just said is super important, and that is, the need to maintain dialogue, even with your most mortal enemy. And it reminds me of something that happened just this weekend where I live. I ran into an extremely famous politician who I'm not going to name, who I'd had interactions with before. And I ran into him in the market buying food, the bad market, not the organic market. I had to go to the bad market and get the packaged stuff once a month. Anyway, I looked up and I said, "Hey, it's person X. What's going on? What are you doing these days?" And he said what he was doing. He said, "What are you doing?" And I said, I'm still doing international human rights law stuff, but mostly I write novels now. In fact, I wrote a novel about the end of billionaires, and then I wrote a novel about the end of dictators, and then I'm writing a novel now about the end of the fossil fuel industry." And he goes, "That's great. Have a great life. Bye." And then he walked away. And then I'm like, I cannot believe he just walked away after I said this. And I went one way, he went the other, and then, of course, we come together again in aisle 3, and there's no one else around, and I said, "Dude, you can't just walk away from somebody that you have a political disagreement with, who you just happen to run into in the market." And he's like, "Oh, well, I'm just in a hurry, I have to look after my son," and things like that. I said, "That's not the reason you walked away." I said, "Just remember that we live in a democracy. The One Nation Party," which he was not a member of, is now the biggest party in the opinion polls in the country. Everyone needs to talk in order to find a way to move things forward. So it's a reminder to everybody that whether you're left or right or center, you got to keep talking. And Australia, in particular, needs to acknowledge that there isn't a reason why generally reasonable Australians who most people most of the time are now putting their faith in an extreme right-wing party, at least in opinion polls 2 years before the next election. So it may well not go that way. But where does the anger come from? And anger is a psychological reaction to something. And we need to acknowledge that that anger is real. And the other prevailing Democratic parties really need to strongly find a way to address that anger in a much better way than the United States did, than Argentina did, than Hungary did for 16 years, than Holland did for a few short years. And if we do that, we can avoid the pitfalls of what has happened in many other countries across the world.
I'll add to that with Scott, what Scott was talking about, listening, and answer to your question also about what the one thing we can do. Not too long ago, because of my film, How to Save Democracy, I got an email from someone and it was a death threat. And he said, I hope you die by fire. And I thought about writing to him and asking him, but I did not. But, I was just like, many politicians are getting death threats in the United States these days, probably Australia too. But it made me sad to think people will do that, especially when they don't know someone. And it made me think about a couple of years ago in the United States, the Deliberative Democracy Lab I think that's the name of it, out of Stanford University in California, put together an event called Americans in One Room. And I think they brought together 500 people in one place, a hotel, for the weekend. And I think they selected them so the mix would be people of all different stripes politically who normally would yell nasty things at each other, maybe send death threats, but they all talked about what's going on. And there's video. People can look it up online on YouTube. They can see the videos. People talked about the experience of being with someone of a different political stripe and getting to know them and finding out that they're not so different after all. And I think our political process now, especially again in the United States, because of what, Scott, you were talking about, the gerrymandering and all these things that are bringing in the worst type of politicians. People have been polarized to such terrible degrees that the hate is just through the roof, and it leads to politicians, as we were talking about earlier, who play on that hate to make people fearful and drum up that hate. It's the politics of grievance, and I'm sure that's the far right party in Australia is using that same playbook. So hearing each other and realizing we're not that different, we all share the same human experience, goes a long way towards bridging the gap. And I think, so many people want a better world. And when they can understand that, that what divides us is artificial. And when we realize there's the biggest division of all is what we're talking about before, of that small percentage who are so wealthy and have hijacked political systems for their own good. That's and the solutions, as we talked about, are not that complicated. Putting guardrails on wealth accumulation, and people can find the way to unite when we realize we're just being manipulated in unfortunate ways, and being divided from each other and from that human experience.
It's really interesting to me, like just that highlight you make there, Michael, around, thinking about, binaries, that forced choice of, right or left. I mean, it's a fundamental feature of anxiety, forced choice. So we live in a time where we have all the knowledge that we have the knowledge of the human brain, we have the knowledge of economics, we have the knowledge of politics, we have this extraordinary amount of knowledge that we've never possessed in a previous democratic era. what we need now, and this is a kind of feature of Prigoghine's idea of dissipative systems. The energy moves out, but in order to reorganize at a higher level or at a more kind of sustainable level to create cohesion, you need to put energy in, and that energy is will. That energy is joint effort, and it's just so inspiring to be able to have conversations like this, because we probably wouldn't have been having these 40 years ago. These ideas about what's available, what we can do, what we can put together in order to facilitate change. So I leave the conversation with a great deal of hope, though not naive hope, because it really is up to kind of everyone to kind of put that effort in to create change.
Thank you, everyone. I guess for me, I'm just reflecting on the simplicity of some of the solutions and the practicality of like wealth guardrails as one. And I guess what I mentioned earlier, that the more that I contemplate these things, that there are principles that pop out, and that the chaos doesn't seem so chaotic anymore. And I really love this final emphasis we've had on the importance of dialogue, which I'm hoping we've modeled in this conversation. So Michael, wanted to say a huge thank you for coming on the podcast. Been so impressed with your humility, your wisdom, your commitment to ethics, and your visionariness, as well as the breadth of that vision. And it's just iron sharpens iron. And it's just so lovely to have a like-minded person on the podcast. And I feel inspired to try to embody more of this in my own life because of this conversation. So thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, thank you, Jordan. It's been an honor. And Nigel and Scott. Yeah, it was great dialogue. And it's such important dialogue.
Well, thank you, Jordan, Nigel, and Michael in particular for joining us today at Democracy Tomorrow. We'll be back next week with another guest and a whole series of subsequent guests in the run-up to our Democracy Mind course, which starts on the 8th of October and goes until the 17th of December, once a week for 11 weeks. Please like and subscribe. I know it's boring to say that, but it does really help us to achieve our objectives. And so with that, keep thinking democratically, keep thinking globally, and we'll see you soon again on Democracy Tomorrow. Thanks for watching, everybody. Take care. Bye.
Bye.